Hello students, in today's session we are going to discuss the nature of labor legislations in India. To understand this, we need to travel back in time and look at how workers were treated in ancient, medieval and colonial periods. If we look at the ancient period, labor was largely unorganized. People worked as farmers, craftsmen or artisans. There was some recognition for skilled workers like blacksmiths, potters or weavers, and they sometimes enjoyed partial protective laws or guild-like protection. For example, in medieval times, craftsmen often worked under royal patronage and were sometimes given privileges. But these protections were very limited, and the vast majority of workers had no real legal safeguards. Now, along with this, there existed harsh systems such as slavery and bonded labor. Slaves had almost no rights. They were tied to their masters and were subjected to restriction on their movement, their work, and even their personal freedom. One of the most common forms was agricultural slavery. Here, poor peasants or landless farmers were forced to work for landlords generation after generation. This became even more rigid under the bonded labor system, where if a laborer took a loan, he would have to work for his master until the debt was repaid. In practice, this debt often passed on to the children, trapping families in a cycle of endless exploitation. And the worst part? This bonded labor was often socially recognized, meaning society accepted it as normal. Now let us move forward to the British period. Many students think that when the British came, they modernized our legal system and improved conditions. But in reality, for the working class, the early British labor legislations were suppressive and exploitative. Let's take one important example, the Workmen as Breach of Contract Act. At first glance, it might sound like a fair law, but in practice it was highly unjust. If a worker signed a contract with an employer and later wanted to leave the job, maybe because of low wages or bad conditions, he could be punished, even imprisoned. But what about the employer? If the employer exploited the worker or refused to pay wages, there was no real penalty. So the law was completely one-sided, favoring the employers and punishing the workers. Another shocking example was the Assam Labor Emigration Act. This law was used to send poor workers to the tea plantations of Assam. On paper, it looked like a migration scheme. But in practice, it was forced labor. Workers who reached Assam often found themselves trapped, living in terrible conditions, with little freedom to move or return home. Many historians even compare this to slavery under a legal disguise. So, you can see how during the colonial period, laws were not meant to protect Indian workers. Instead, they were designed to supply cheap labor for British industries and plantations, keeping workers under strict control. However, students, it is also important to note that even during this period, there were some partial protective measures. For example, certain laws were made to regulate apprenticeships or to give limited protections to skilled artisans and craftsmen. These were not out of kindness, but rather because the British wanted to preserve the quality of work and ensure production for their own benefit. But still, these laws were very narrow in scope. The majority of workers, especially those in agriculture, plantations, and small industry, continued to live in miserable conditions without rights or protection. In short, early labor laws did not serve the worker. Instead, they served the masters, landlords, and colonial rulers. It was only much later, with the rise of industrialization, trade unions, social reform movements, and international labor standards, that protective and welfare-oriented labor legislations truly began to emerge. Now, let us carefully understand the main causes that led to the rise of modern labor legislation in India. Let's start with industrialization. During the 19th and 20th centuries, industries grew rapidly in India. Thousands of workers were employed in factories, mines, and plantations, but their working conditions were miserable. 12 to 14 hours of work a day, child labor, unhygienic workplaces, and very low wages. For example, in textile mills of Bombay and jute mills of Bengal, workers lived in overcrowded chawls and had no job security. This large-scale exploitation created an urgent demand for protective laws. Now, workers did not remain silent. They started to unite and form labor unions. The earliest organized union was the Madras Labor Union in 1980. Later, national-level unions like the All India Trade Union Congress, ATUC, came up. These unions started raising strong demands, better wages, few working hours, safety in factories, and the right to dignity. Their strikes and protests forced the government to listen and pass protective laws. At the same time, new political and social ideas were spreading across the world. Socialist ideology was gaining strength, especially after the Russian Revolution of 1970. Socialism taught that workers are not just tools for profit, they are human beings with rights. This ideology strongly influenced leaders of India's freedom movement like Jawaharlal Nehru and Subhas Chandra Bose, who supported labor reforms. As India moved closer to independence, the ideas of political freedom and equality became powerful. If a nation wanted to be free, its workers too needed freedom from exploitation. Gradually, voting rights were extended, and when workers got political power, governments could no longer ignore them. This democratic participation became a big reason behind new welfare laws. Another important cause was the recognition of human values. Reformers and social leaders began to speak about the dignity of labor. For example, Mahatma Gandhi emphasized the importance of protecting workers, especially women and children, from exploitation. This moral awakening shifted focus from profit-making alone to human welfare. A major turning point came with the establishment of the International Labour Organization, ILO. India was one of its founding members. The ILO passed conventions on working hours, child labor, minimum wages, and social security. India, as a member, was expected to follow these standards. This international pressure played a big role in shaping modern labor legislation. Finally, after independence, the Constitution of India gave a clear direction. The directive principles of state policy said that the state must ensure humane working conditions, living wages, and social security. This made labor welfare not just a social demand but a constitutional duty of the government. Together, these factors transformed labor laws in India. From being suppressive and exploitative, they moved towards becoming protective, welfare-oriented, and focused on justice. In our next session, we will study the types of modern labor legislations. If this is useful for you, please like and share the video and subscribe our channel. If you want PPT, then visit PPT section of my website. Link is given in description box. If you would like to purchase my book on labor law and industrial relations, the link is provided in the description box below. And if you want to practice free multiple choice questions on this topic, you can visit the multiple choice questions section on our website. The link for that is also given in the description box. Thanks for watching. In our coming videos, we will study more about labor legislation and also look at important acts one by one. So stay connected.